Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nora Benedict, and I am an assistant professor of Spanish and Digital Humanities at the University of Georgia. And that's in Athens, Georgia. And in terms of my research and what I focus on, I'm really interested in book history, as you can see by my collection behind me. I also study print culture, broadly speaking, and I'm interested in how materials are accessed, maintained, and preserved over time. And this pertains to not only the material record, but also digital records, hence my interest in digital humanities, network analysis, and things of the like. In terms of my geographical focus, I focus on Latin America, specifically Argentina, and more broadly, Southern Cone literature. So today I've been asked to share with you some of my reflections and observations on pedagogy and teaching, and a little bit about kind of classroom environment and strategies to think about in this new world as we turn to online teaching more so now than ever. And so broadly speaking, when I'm teaching, something that really matters to me a lot is fostering a very communicative, safe, and friendly environment in a space that students can feel the freedom to express themselves, the freedom to explore, and kind of push themselves a lot too. I like to try to challenge students and thinking outside of the box. I employ a lot of what might be called Montessori methods, in that we kind of come at issues from different ways using not only different materials, but different mediums. And I'm going to share two examples with you today to kind of illustrate that communicative, kind of passionate way of teaching. And I hope that these examples can be used in a variety of different types of learning environments. And while my examples come from a literature class, a 3000 level Spanish literature introduction class, I think that a lot of the fundamental aspects at their core can be applied to other types of classrooms, teaching, learning experiences. And so the examples that I've chosen to share with you and the lesson plans that will be available through the NHC site are related to one example before online teaching was a necessity. So kind of transitioning and seeing how these more creative outlets can be used in both mediums, face-to-face and online instruction. And the second was from the later half of this past spring semester in adapting activities that I had planned for the classroom into a digital environment. And so I'm going to switch here to share my screen so that we can all see the PowerPoint that I'm working with. And so I've kind of thought about the question here today in terms of teaching creatively and teaching compassionately is something that's really important for me. And as I said, I'm going to have two different examples. The first is face-to-face instruction, an example that can really help motivate students, get them moving and thinking and kind of approaching material in new ways. And this specific example, as I said, is drawn from a Spanish literature class. And it's an activity that was designed by a member of my cohort at the University of Virginia when I was a graduate student, Jessica Daves, and this is called Ambiguous Scenes, Escenas Ambiguas, and it's from the first day of an introduction to the genre of theater. And so for a lot of students, literature in general is hard to approach. Theater, poetry, these seem kind of more difficult to get in a creative zone, and especially when they're in a foreign language. And so this activity, Ambiguous Scenes, thinks about all the things that are not the dialogue. So one of the most important things about reading a play, engaging with a piece of theater, is recognizing that there are different types of textual elements present that are vital to understanding and getting a sense of what's happening in the text. And so I'm trying to teach my students that these classes are not just about reading the words printed on the page. There's so much more that goes into a work of literature, whether that's thinking about the material aspects of the compositor, the typesetter, or the designer, or thinking about these extra textual elements that are so fundamental for theater, also reading and hearing the oral aspects of poetry. And so in terms of theater, we're trying to think about not just the dialogues, not just what's being said, but the entire ambiance that's being created. And so with this activity, the goal more or less is to break the classroom, everyone, into groups of 4. And you can kind of scale up, scale down, depending on the size of your classroom. And everyone is given a small, short script to perform. And I gave them about 10 minutes or so to prepare in any way that they saw fit. And they were able to bring their scripts to the front of the classroom, so they didn't have to memorize or anything like that. And I allowed them to use the whiteboard, move furniture, chairs, things like that around to help create a scene. They were allowed to use sounds, music from their phones. They could adjust the lighting. And so they really had a lot of freedom in trying to create the scene for their piece of theater. And I told them to be very creative as possible and to be very specific, since their classmates would not be allowed to read their scripts. And the thing that was so important about that is that, and I'm going to kind of show you here, if this lets me exit, these scenes, as we can see here, might not be all Spanish speakers here, but there are descriptions here. We have kind of stage directions. We have the description of the 4 individuals, A, B, C, D, and then we have the dialogue. So this is group 1. And if we move to group 2, we see different descriptions for the individuals. We see a different scene here. We're at a party. Before we were in a jail, but importantly, the script, the words that are spoken, the dialogue is identical. The only things that are changing between these 4 scenes, here we are in a house, and this is more kind of a love triangle scene. The only things that are changing are the individuals, their characters, and where it's being set, where it's taking place. And so the students had a couple chuckles during the first performance, shall we say, when they realized that, oh, that's the same dialogue that we have, but it's in a completely different environment and it takes on different meaning. And so this was a really important revelation, and I think it allowed them early on, this was one of the first classes of the semester, it allowed them to really get a sense of what reading literature involves. And so these were some kind of questions I asked my students in taking away as part of this activity. What did you learn from this exercise, apart from the difficulty of acting? I guess my students might think that I'm a little cruel at the beginning, putting them up and kind of requiring that they do all of these in front of the class activities. But at the end of the day, they were grateful for the ability to kind of feel comfortable and foster dialogues and friendships with their classmates. But ultimately, this helped them think through, how am I going to approach different types of literature? And I tried to do similar hands-on adjusting activities for the different units, different genres of literature that we discussed, so that they would have a set of tools that they could use moving forward. And once we moved to online teaching, things became slightly different in that I wasn't able to have students perform or interact in the same way. And while that creative hands-on aspect of teaching that's so important for me might seem a little bit difficult, perhaps improbable in an online environment, one thing that I did toward the end of the semester that I think was a really great and successful exercise, and also allowed them to have kind of creative outlet and think not about everything that was happening in the world, or think about everything that was happening in the world, but in a different light, was the last unit of the class, which was about literature. We discussed electronic literature. And within this unit, we learned about a platform called Twine, which is an open source tool for telling interactive non-linear stories. So this is very much similar to the choose your own adventure style of books or stories, things like that. And it's pretty easy to use. I gave my students a line-by-line tutorial on how to make a twine, and it was one of the last days of class, and I required them all to send me the link to the HTML for their Twine story, and I uploaded them to our class website where everyone was able to look at and interact. And I had my students using another tool called Flipgrid, where you can post videos and audios answering questions. And a lot of students used their Flipgrids for that week to talk about how much of a great experience it was to use Twine and kind of create something that was their own, even though there were some problems along the way. Those problems really helped them think through what they were trying to do. And I gave them an example, and here you can see the format for Twine is kind of a lot like a storyboard in that you get those directions. And this was one that I created as a model for them that I called it an adventure. And you can see here the kind of forking paths that are created. And this Twine in particular looks something like this. This is the Spanish version that I sent for them. But basically you have the ability to interact with these stories. And so you can decide to, on this dark and stormy night, when there's a lot of wind blowing and someone knocks on your door, you can open the door. You can, I guess I opened the door. But you also had the option to hide under the bed or call your mother. So we're gonna open the door and we see that, they're slowly opening. And you can open the box that you see at the foot of the door. You can close the door, you can scream. If you scream, that's the end, but there are different options. And so this is the model that I gave to my students, and they were really lovely, the responses. Two in particular, one called the Tiger, which was kind of roughly based on the Tiger King that was big at the time that we were doing this activity. Students really had a fun time creating their own, adding images. Another student made kind of an interactive, more digital technology within the digital storytelling, and was riffing off of popular culture. And so I think that in general, this activity really gave them a sense of freedom, a sense of expression, and allowed them to think about literature in a way that they hadn't before, because a lot of my students were not literature majors, they were not Spanish majors. And so often it's hard to encourage and get these students invested in the material. And I found that having these more creative exercises that takes the knowledge and the skill sets and extrapolates it into something that is truly their own and something that's more kind of playful, allows for a greater amount of freedom and allows for more successful outcomes, and the students have a great time. And in my experience, this has been something that's been very exciting for me in teaching. So I look forward to talking with some of you later today and hearing all of your questions, comments, concerns about all things pedagogy in the kind of compassionate and creative realm.